So why don't I start with my most important producer, which is George Martin.
Okay, before you get to that, let's. There's something that needs to be said. What the hell does a producer do?
Oh, great point.
Yeah. Now, even though I've been, working musician since I was 14 or whatever. I always I thought the producer was more responsible for the technical side. I always associated producer, the title of producer, with probably the engineer or the mixer. And it's not necessarily that at all.
No, it's not.
In the case of, say, Andrew Loog Oldham, who thought that electric guitars were plugged into a wall socket. What is a producer to you? I mean, I guess I'll just say I think a producer is a guy who hangs around and runs his mouth. Offers an opinion.
So the producer is basically the person. In a great example of this, I forgot to put him on my list, is the producer of London Calling. Guy Stevens was the myth is throwing chairs around the studio and trying to get the Clash to get their energy up. The producer is usually not at the control board. The producer is more kind of like the movie director in a way. Trying to keep the energy up. Why don't we try another take of that?
The vision thing, as a certain ex-president would have it, that vision thing.
That vision thing, right. Keeping the energy up. Maybe it's time to take a break. Why don't you guys go out and, play football for a while outside, and let's do another take. Let's just keep at it. It's really that overall vision thing, as opposed to being, actually mixing the tracks at the board.
Well, okay, and I would also, there's a discrepancy, and you should know this because you actually, you do know this, but the terms mixer, I would say that's the engineer. The engineer initially is the guy, he's the tape operator. He's putting the sounds down, so.
Okay, now that's right.
Art to itself, which often comes, much later in the process after the recording of the basic tracks.
That's a very good point. So really we shouldn't say mixer. We should say the engineer is the person at the board, and then there's the producer, and then the person mixing might come in after they've totally recorded everything to, mix the different levels of the tracks.
And there can be overlap.
There can be overlap, yeah.
Occupations, which we'll no doubt get to.
Right.
Clearmountain would be a great example of that. He's primarily known as a mixer by his own admission, but he has found himself in the producer's chair, particularly back in the day, back in the 80s, for his just overall sensibilities. So he's a guy who would wear a couple hats in the initial recordings, the initial basic recordings of the basic backing tracks.
Right, and mixing is an art in itself. You can have the greatest performance and the greatest tracks, but if they're not mixed with the right balance, if the drums aren't loud enough in relation to the guitars, you can just sound all wrong, which is one reason why Pink Floyd and Dark Side of the Moon, I guess they tried all these different people to mix the tracks, and Chris Thomas kind of came out the winner, right? Because it had to have that certain je ne sais quoi to get, capture the vibe.
I didn't know Chris Thomas was involved in that.
Apparently, yeah, he was the one they chose for mixing it.
Really? Because he's a guy that I would always associate, certainly as a producer later on in his career, but as primarily an engineer. Well, that's maybe just my ignorance. I didn't know. A lot of these guys, as we pointed out, wear several hats,
right,
in their duties in the studio. Well, you go ahead. Let's talk about George Martin.
Yeah, so George Martin is a good place to start because he's a great example of that. You know, things were very regimented at Abbey Road. The staff actually wore like white lab coats, and there was a person almost like unionized jobs, right? There was a tape operator, and there was the engineers at the desk, and then there was George Martin, who was going down, kind of walking between. The Beatles were down the stairs in Abbey Road Studio 2, and they'd be looking down through the glass, and he'd be going down. They're often doing the initial takes like live as a band and talking to them like, okay, how are we going to arrange this? Let's try this chorus 2 times. What if you did this here? And kind of, the liaison, if you will, between the band and the rest of the staff. So he basically produced all the Beatles music with, a few minor exceptions that we really don't need to go into here. And because, you and I have talked before, he had a classical music background, he could actually arrange music like they needed an orchestral score. He knew how to do that. He could write music for the musicians that would come in for the sessions. If they needed, like the song In My Life, they needed like a Baroque kind of piano solo. He recorded that, recorded it at half speed, and then they sped it up so it sounded even cooler. So he could play parts if they needed. He was open to their experimentation. He wasn't, even though he was older than them and more formal, because of his previous experience with like comedy records and sound experimentation, he was open to their ideas, and he could recognize, the genius of what they were doing, and translate it. Especially John Lennon, who would just say, "Oh, I want this to sound orange or brown or whatever." He could actually had the patience to listen to that and try to come up with solutions. And he, from the first record to the last, he was their producer, often called the fifth Beatle.
Sure, right. Well, Billy Preston sometimes got that applied to him as well.
Right, but Billy Preston only played on one 1.5 records of their stuff, whereas George Martin was there the whole time.
Right, yeah. I was just
and then we can also, George Martin, his highlight was definitely the Beatles, but he definitely, he did other things like the America albums, like Ventura Highway and, all those hits by America. He did Jeff Beck. He did Paul McCartney, Tug of War. So he definitely had things. He opened up a studio, Air Studios in Montserrat, where like all the bands in the 80s, like the Police and Phil Collins, a lot of hits were recorded at his studio before a volcano destroyed the studio like 10 years later. So that's an interesting part of his legacy as well.
Yeah. I think the Stones recorded a chunk of emotional rescue there. Yeah. Now, I would say that, well, it may not be entirely accurate. I'll get to Phil Spector, I guess, later. But, he offered a similar kind of vision thing as George Martin did for the United States. And the orchestral arrangements, he was a musician, not very accomplished, but for me, even more important, as important as Phil Spector in the U.S. would be the Motown team of Holland, Dozier Holland, Evan Whitfield, Barrett Strong, who were the primary songwriters, but also producers from roughly 1959 to 72, roughly like that. And so they also operated as the production staff, the house production staff. Eddie Holland and his brother Brian Holland and Lamont Dozier, Norman Whitfield, Barrett Strong. So all those, great tracks, The Temptations, The Four Tops, Supremes, Smokey Robinson, The Miracles. That's not only their songwriting, but their production, their vision, their technique. And you could say, and as has been said, Motown is the original sort of factory, an identifiable sound, and it's almost mirrored in today's pop music paradigm, where you have a whole stable of people, songwriters, in-house songwriters, in-house production staff. Of course, the setup is different. The technicalities of actual recording are vastly different. But that sort of paradigm of we just pump out the hits and we give it an identifiable sound, for better or worse today. I say for better or worse today. Back then it was pretty unimpeachable. If you like the Motown sound, you really like the sound, and it went on for over a decade.
And it's an interesting sound, isn't it? I mean, it's unique. It was really taking like R&B and kind of polishing it up, and it's almost like got a reggae thing going on with that, kind of chink-a-chink-a-chink-a kind of, very stringent, like percussive chords along with the beat, and it really had a definitive, beautiful sound to it.
Well, interesting that the classic house band was known as the Funk Brothers, and it's not a funky sound per se. It's not what would turn into what we know as American funk until, say, the late 60s. And that you'd have to go further south into Memphis for that. That would be Stax Folk.
That's right.
And that was vastly, almost the polar opposite of the Motown sound. Very stripped down. Almost martial rather than funky. It would take Sly Stone, I think, really to what we identify today as funk. But Jim Stewart was the guy behind Stax Volt, and he would be up there on my list with the house band being Booker T and the MGs. So, I mean, Otis Redding is probably my favorite single artist ever, and probably my favorite male singer ever. But it's not just him. It's just everybody. Sam and Dave. Irma Thomas, Rufus Thomas are dead, and Wilson Pickett. Just all these great artists, and many just one-off people who only had one or two singles recorded, but they all had that sound, this very basic, dry, stripped-down sound. Unlike Motown, no embellishments, no sort of Baroque or florid or orchestra feel.
Now we're talking to bring us back to production, do we know who was producing those songs for Stax?
Jim Stewart.
Jim Stewart was producing, okay.
And the owner. He's the owner and the founder.
I know he was the owner, but he was actually the producer?
Yeah, with his sister.
Okay.
Now, was he... Yeah, he knew his way around, a mixing board. I'm sure they had other engineers. And other people... Isaac Hayes, was an in-house producer, actually played keyboards when, say, Booker T was, not available or out on the road. Booker T they didn't tour much.
Right.
They did a couple, very famous and legendary tours. The Stax tour of 1967, 66 in Europe. But generally they were just, a studio band.
Right.
Jim Stewart was the de facto house producer, as I understand it. And I think he actually knew the technical side as well, the engineering side. And he was a musician. He's mainly, a country folk musician. And he just gravitated towards, he just really, really loved, African-American music, as it was, being developed in real time in the early 60s.
Right.
So sort of an odd, pairing. He's, a country musician. And of course, Memphis, has, a very rich tradition of country music as well. So it's not that, odd. And both, Motown and Stax would be examples of that, sort of hit factory,
Yeah.
We crank out the hits, and we have a sound, an identifiable sound. We have, a backing band that, always hits the mark, always delivers. We have the ability. Well, another thing, it should be noted that Stax Volt, they almost hardly ever used overdubbing.
Oh, interesting.
I think the extent of their recording capabilities up until, roughly 1970 was, 8-track. It's probably very high tech back then.
So they were basically just playing it as a band live, capturing it as a live performance almost?
Yeah. The main studio at Stax was a converted theater. And apparently the mixing was on the elevated stage.
And I have to say, I've been there actually. It's a museum now, and I believe the original burned down and they recreated it, but at least the recreation is there.
So you've seen. So what does the room look like? The mixing, the booth is elevated. Is that correct? Is that how they reproduced it?
The mixing desk, I seem to remember it was actually in the large room itself. I could be wrong about that, but I do remember the room was big, it almost felt like a gymnasium or something.
Yeah, well, it was a theater.
Like theater size.
Yeah, I think not a movie theater, but more a old timey stage theater.
Yeah. It had a cool vibe.
Yeah. And you've been to Abbey Road as well. Jeez.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen the Motown? They have a museum for their.
Yeah, I've been there as well. Now, that's interesting. That's just Motown Studio is just like in a house, like on a street. Very small, and the studio is just in the basement, and there's a room with glass for the mixing board, and then the actual recording studio is like somebody's living room. That's very small. And then they show you when you start the tour, there's in the main level, there's a kind of a square hole in the ceiling to go up to the attic. And they said that's where they would wire up. That's where they recorded all the reverb. And the tour guide demonstrates and claps his hands, and you can hear the reverb up in the attic. And it's very homemade, yet this beautiful organic sound they got there.
And they get that huge sound from It's kind of ironic that you say Stax is actually a very big room.
Right.
That they have kind of a very compact, very organic, sound. And Motown, a very small studio. But they would. well, yeah, they, used overdubbing and all that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're with the oldies. I mean, what we get into? Let's talk about Chris Thomas. Speaking of the Beatles, I believe got his start working with the Beatles. I think on the White Album. That's like second engineer or something. What do you? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think he worked on the White Album. I think he may have been there, like, a few years by that point. But yeah, he worked on the White Album. And I think the story goes that George Martin was kind of sick of them by then and just decided to go on vacation in the middle of recording and left him a note like, I'm going on vacation. You'll be fine. Please look after the boys. See you in 2 weeks. And he's like, oh, okay.
Nice.
Yeah, so kind of trial by fire. So yeah, he worked on that. He mixed Dark Side of the Moon, Badfinger last two albums, Sex Pistols, Anarchy in the UK single, Pulp, Different Class, Wings, Back to the Egg, The Pretenders, the first two albums, the EP, then Learning to Crawl. Those are kind of highlights for me for Chris Thomas. What do you got?
Well, yeah, he's got a very, very long, distinguished CV, obviously. But for me, it's the hallmark of Thomas's sound, and what introduced me was the Sex Pistols. Never mind the Bullocks. It's the Sex Pistols, which was done with Bill Price, and the story that Bill Price told was that Chris Thomas did the initial single, Anarchy in the UK, and Malcolm McLaren, who was the Pistols manager, would bring them both in at different times to record different tracks as potential singles. And maybe you've heard this story too.
Yeah,
I've
heard a version of it.
And finally, they're putting the album together based on tracks that Chris and Bill had recorded, and apparently they both confronted Malcolm and said, what's the deal here? Yeah, well, they figured out Malcolm was trying to pull a fast one and not pay either.
Right.
And they just said, okay, look, hand over the money, and me, Chris and Bill, we'll divvy it up between ourselves. So the credits on the album actually say produced by Chris Thomas or Bill Price.
Yeah, I had heard a version of that too, and that no one knows for sure like who produced what, because they didn't keep accurate records of of who exactly did it.
That was my introduction to, because the sound of that record of the Pistols album is just it's monolithic. It's extremely textured, extremely dense. It's murky. It's muddy. There have been remasters through the years, but that was a hallmark of Chris Thomas's sound for me that would endure until I lost track of his work, and Bill Price's. So for Chris Thomas, it would be the Pistols album. Mm-hmm. And they both specialized, both Bill Price and Chris Thomas specialized in really, really great drum sounds. Mm-hmm. Paul Cook's drum sound with the Pistols. Another album which came out very shortly after that, which I rank as good, as great the Pistols or even the Clash's debut album, which was, a very, low rent, job, featuring the sound man as de facto producer, would be the Tom Robinson Band's debut. They only did 2 albums, but Power in the Darkness, and that features, Chris Thomas as the producer and Bill Price as, lead engineer. And again, the drum sound, Dolphin Taylor, only did that first album, the Tom Robinson Band, and then he left the band and joined Spit's Little Fingers for one album. It's got, again, it has this great texture, this murky, very rich, deep sound. It's very bassy, very, very drum heavy.
This is the Tom Robinson albums you're talking about now?
Yes, I'm talking about, Power in the Darkness.
Okay.
And he really, really knew how to record electric guitars. So, Steve Jones, the multiple overdubs on Pistols album. He was a great player live. He could, he'd pull it off live. They showed that in 1996 on the Pistols did a reunion and released a live album, which again Chris Thomas produced. And I think there's no overdubs that I can hear. Filthy Lucre live is the name of that album. So Thomas, Steve Jones, he's a great guitar player, but it's just a very dense sound that Thomas had and pulled off. And Bill Price, in his own right, had that quality too. Think of his work with, say, Mott the Hooples, the final 2 albums, Mott and then the Hoople. And again, Buffin's drum sound, how he recorded the drums, I'm sure was very, very important and probably had a lot to do with Glyn Johns. Remember. And I think, Glyn, wrote a book a few years ago. I haven't read it.
I read it.
Huh?
I read it.
I've seen some videos that he's made, tutorials, like one of miking drums.
Yeah.
And apparently he'd use 3 mics. Every drum was not close mic'd at all.
Oh, interesting.
He'd have, one, vaguely to the left of the hi-hat and the snare, an overhead mic, and I want to say one vaguely between the kick drum and the floor tom. So I think that was a setup. And so he used that for, I don't know how he did it with the Who, considering, Keith Moon's, setup, his large drum set, but also his crazy style of playing.
I've got him listed here as co-producer on Who's Next, which is a great sounding record.
Yeah, it is. And they actually got some punch from Keith Moon then. Some drum punch. He dialed back his theatricality, his histrionics on the drums. I think Glyn engineered the Small Faces Ogden's Nut Gun Flake, which is my favorite Small Faces album and one of my favorite albums anyway. And as we spoke a little bit ago about how I think the mono of that is so much superior. It really accentuates Kenny Jones and Ronnie Lane's rhythm patterns, rhythm section patterns, which are very catchy, very punchy, and the initial U.S. stereo mix.
Well, that's interesting. You mentioned Ronnie Lane and the Small Faces, because 2 of the albums I listed for Glyn Johns are Faces, which were an outgrowth of the Small Faces. A Nod is as Good as a Wink, and Rough Mix, Ronnie Lane and Pete Townsend, which are both great sounding records.
Yeah, they are. They're great sounding records. They're great, artistically. Both very great records. Glyn did. Well, the Faces only put out 4 proper studio albums, but other than the debut, First Steps, which is actually listed as Small Faces, the cover of the U.S. version. He did Long Player, Not As Good As a Wink, and their Swan Song, Ooh La La. And
those are good
sounding records. The guitars, those Brits, they really knew how to record drums and electric guitars for maximum impact. It's like the first, probably second wave, British, rock and roll, invasion, whatever you want to call it, but I'm talking about late 60s, early to mid 70s. And Glyn Johns is behind a lot of that. I think he was a very well respected producer and engineer. Kind of like George Martin, a very older, very proper, very formal English gentleman, teetotaler, didn't brook any nonsense from his. I don't know how he got along with so many of these crazy rock and rollers in the studio, but he did. And
another tangent related to Glyn Johns is his brother was Ethan Johns, who, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't he produce television's Marquee Moon?
Are we talking about Andy Johns?
Well, that was Andy Johns.
Andy Johns, yeah. He as an engineer, he worked with a lot of the same people, his older brother did. The Stones, and I think primarily as an engineer, but I think he had some production credits in his own right as well. So he did the first television album, Marquee Moon?
You see, now talk about a great recorded album. That's just a great sounding record, the drums and guitars. You're right. It was produced by, I'm looking at it right now, produced by the band's frontman Tom Verlaine and sound engineer Andy Johns. So I know that's an album you still want to discover more, but just in terms of sound, it's recorded very well.
Well, again, you got a lot to work with. You got a great drummer in Billy Fica. You got 2 great guitar players in Verlaine and Richard Lloyd. So, even though, the British scene, punk scene or whatever, was vastly different from the American, particularly the New York City scene.
Yeah.
Both drums and guitars. And by and large, the British guys seem to, I think because they really pioneered these great recording techniques for small combos, small bands, as opposed to, the big Phil Spector, Motown sounds of the 60s, which were going out of fashion, and or George Martin, his orchestral Baroque touches with the Beatles, who, of course, by 1970, broke up, ushering in, a new decade and a new era. So the lessons learned by these guys from these Brits, there's a great passage on the Stones' Sticky Fingers from 71 that says, in very small print, the recording cycles are dBs, decibels, and blah, 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 57, blah, blah, very technical stuff. And this album has been recorded according to the Guy Stevens manual of recording. Of course, Guy Stevens, produced and with an engineer. Early on, he worked with Small Faces and all kinds of bands. By the time he did London Calling with the Clash, he was considered washed up. He was heavily alcoholic and drug dependent, and really didn't do much or anything on the technical side. That was all Mick Jones and Bill Price engineering, doing the actual production work. As you mentioned earlier, Guy was his primary function as producer was to create a vibe, a vision thing.
So now technically, Jimmy Miller was the official producer of Sticky Fingers, correct?
Yes. And so just to finish these notes, it's if you disagree with any of these, sonic levels from this, just turn the volume up on the record. Which is very funny. The Stones had always recorded their records, at least in the mastering process, and probably in the mixing process too, with the bass, Bill Wyman's bass playing, primarily Bill, and Charlie's kick drum, kind of low, I'm sure it was with the thought that these records were going to be played very loud at house parties and wherever. You're going to be playing a new Stones record really bloody loud. And so you didn't want, the low end to be making your turntable, skip the needle jump just through sheer volume. And that's down to the mastering process and all that, and that's very technical stuff, which I don't fully understand. Maybe you know a bit more about. But you mentioned Jimmy Miller. And
okay. Before we get too deep with Jimmy Miller, I just want to bring to a conclusion your thought earlier. You said Sticky Fingers was produced according to the Guy Stevens methodology. So can you flesh that out a little bit about what that methodology was at that point?
This is a note that was on the original vinyl.
Okay.
Sticky Fingers, on the inner sleeve, dust sleeve, the liner notes, and I don't know if it's been reproduced on the various CD reissues or remasters.
But how do you interpret that? What is the methodology that they're alluding to?
I think it was kind of a joke, kind of a fistic. They were saying this record essentially is a really technically very well recorded album, and if you don't agree, just turn it up. It'll sound better.
Okay.
I could grab a copy, a CD copy of Sticky Fingers. I've got a few of them, different, but I don't know if I'd be able to read it because it's very small print. That's what I took it to mean. Famously, the album preceding Sticky Fingers for the Stones was Let It Bleed, and at the end of the liner notes on that, it said, "Play loud!" exclamation point. And so I'm thinking that had to do with the new recording techniques that were rapidly developing in music, that you should turn it up and it'll sound better. Remember, people were getting into really fancy high-tech stereos and sound systems around that time. And recorded music was, technically the recording process and technologies were, just advancing very rapidly, almost akin to the way they're advancing, well, not recording today. I think it's stagnant today. But encouraging people, it's kind of, turn it up loud. It'll sound really good. And indeed, back then, and that's what people nostalgically long for, the days when you had your, big Pioneer, stereo system with your excellent analog vinyl, and how great things sounded. And that's part of the whole, vinyl fetish, as I call it, revival of today. Oh, it sounds so much better. Well, that's really, a lot of vinyl is actually sourced from, digital transfers,
Yeah.
Just marked up price-wise, It's a marketing thing and a fetish thing.
Well, one interesting thing, you were talking about how the bass had to be, tempered down when you're mastering a vinyl, because otherwise the needle would skip a groove. So an interesting thing now is when they're give you an example, some of the new Beatles remixes for the Red and Blue album, they can finally crank up Ringo's kick drum and Paul's bass, for if you're listening digitally on Spotify, or if you're listening on CD, they can really crank those up and give it more punch. They still have to, be careful when they're mastering vinyl, but technology is much more advanced than being able to bring out the bass and kick drum more today, which is kind of nice.
Yeah. Now, I haven't heard those Beatles, they're actually remixes more than remasters.
Right.
They've done full Giles Martin, George Martin's son, has, done some actual de facto remixes.
Right.
And, the Stones haven't done that. They've done some, horrible sounding remasters, very loud, compressed, brick-walled is the term people use. They did one full-on remix, courtesy of Giles Martin. That was for 1973's Both Side Soup album.
Mm-hmm.
And
also produced by Jimmy Miller, right?
Yeah, it was originally produced by Jimmy Miller. That was his final album with the Stones. And, one of the hallmarks of Jimmy Miller's sound with the Stones, that's where I discovered his work, was with the Stones. His first album was Beggar's Banquet, which was preceded by the non-album single Jumpin' Jack Flash.
Mm-hmm.
And it's B-side, Child of the Moon. It's a murky, deep, dense sound, very heavy on percussion and drums emphasized, and very much like his British counterparts. Jimmy Miller was an American. And so he himself, was a drummer, and a very good drummer, too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's him playing on several Stone songs. You Can't Always Get What You Want, Happy from Keith's song from Exile on Main Street.
Interesting.
Let Loose, another track from Exile on Main Street.
So Charlie Watts didn't play on You Can't Always Get What You Want?
No, he didn't.
Interesting.
That's the story is that he couldn't get the New Orleans second line groove.
Oh, interesting.
And so Charlie actually said, Jimmy, play it for me. And Jimmy played it. I said, okay. Well, why don't you just play it on the track?
Oh, interesting. I had no idea.
And Charlie never played it that way live, ever. And, for 60 years until his death. Never played it like the record. This is nonsense. This story, this myth, this legend about what I just described, how, Jimmy ended up playing on the track. Because the debut of You Can't Always Get What You Want was at the Stones Rock and Roll Circus, which is, recorded and filmed for TV, and the Stones didn't like it. They thought the Who upstaged them, and it wasn't released until the mid-90s, 1995. And they debut the song. It's a brand new song. This is a year before recorded properly for the Let It Bleed album.
Oh, interesting.
And Charlie plays the drum pattern, New Orleans style, Second line, he plays it the same pattern that Jimmy plays.
Okay.
So why he couldn't get it in the studio and Trident Studios, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. So I don't know if that's a true story, you know, of how Jimmy Miller, you know, came to play on it. But if you listen and watch the Stones Rock and Roll Circus film, Charlie plays it, that second line, you know, staggered backbeat, you know, which is kind of a hallmark of a New Orleans groove. And,
I've watched it. You know, that show, the Rock and Roll Circus, loomed large in Beatles lore because John Lennon was in it.
Sure.
But that's interesting that they played You Can't Always Get What You Want so much earlier than the recorded version that came out. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, you know, a lot of these sessions bled into each other, you know, particularly for the Stones, you know, tracks that were recorded for the Olympic Studios for the Beggar's Banquet album, you know, were, you know, redone or touched up, you know, for the Let It Bleed album, and songs for the Let It Bleed sessions proper were left aside and, you know, touched up or overdubbed and you know, repurposed for Sticky Fingers album, and on for, you know, Exile on Main Street. I had songs, you know, dating back to 1968, 69, even though it came out in 72.
Yeah.
And so really the first, well, go and say Silver Train, that originally came out in the Let It Bleed sessions in 69.
Oh, okay.
And after that, it was pretty much, you know, all new material up until, you know, Tattoo You, which is, you know, famously repurposed and overdubbed and, you know, older tracks.
Mm-hmm.
But Jimmy Miller had the same thing, this thing about drums. That a lot of these, you know, British guys like Chris Thomas and Bill Price and Glyn Johns had developed, and that's kind of where Charlie Watts really, his sound and his feel really came to the fore with the Jumpin' Jack Flash single. It's a very simple pattern, very simple.
Great sounding record.
Oh, it's a great record.
Technically not a great sound record, but in terms of feel, you just can't beat it.
Yeah, and the Stones never captured it, ever again live, ever.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the intro, ding, 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 ding,
right.
ding, which is, you know, Keith's overdriven acoustic guitar, which, you know, famously used by, you know, Street Fighting Man and other, you know, was recorded around the same time. They never used that ever again. You know, even on the '69 U.S. tour. You know.
Yeah, but that's interesting that both. Correct me if I'm wrong. Both Jumpin' Jack Flash and Street Fighting Man both had that overdriven acoustic guitar. Is that right?
Yeah. And so it's a studio thing. It's a Frankenstein thing, and the Stones have had many tracks like that. Some of their biggest, you know, Warhorse, you know, hits, which were Frankenstein tracks in the studio. You know, and I'll just start with, you know, their sort of rejuvenation in 1968 with Jumpin' Jack Flash. That would be a classic example. What came after that? Street Fighting Man. Again, they've never played that like the record, ever, live. Charlie played a straight drum pattern. They did do some sessions and some gigs in 1995 with acoustics, with the stripped album, which is, you know, sort of the unplugged, you know, thing that was, you know, very, very much in fashion at the time.
Right.
But Charlie never playing that drum pattern again. The closest they've got is Steve Jordan playing it after Charlie died. What was it, 2021, or 2 years ago? Steve actually really tried to replicate the exact pattern of a lot of Charlie's patterns, but also the tempos too.
Right. So the great irony here is that the irony is that Steve Jordan could actually replicate better than Charlie himself the original recording drum pattern.
Right. Now, I've always wondered about that. Like, what is it? Did Charlie deliberately not want to do this?
That could be also, right? He may have a way he likes to do it live that he just prefers. Who knows?
Yeah. Oh, that's his jazz, improv jazz background. Maybe. I'm sure a lot of that comes into it. Mm-hmm. Nobody was going to tell him. Mick wasn't going to tell him. Certainly not Keith. Oh, Charlie, can you do it more like this? No. After a while, after so many years or decades, it's like, that's Charlie Watts. He's going to play it the way he's going to play it.
Right.
In the studio's another thing. And you're dealing with producers and engineers. That's for posterity. But for the live setting, no, he never did. And in a way, that's a good thing. It's like, okay, if you want to hear the record, save your money and stay at home and listen to the record.
Mm-hmm.
Bands or artists who play replicate the stuff, not note for note, but just like it is on the record. It can work, and it can work well. I'm thinking like Springsteen with the E Street Band.
Right.
But I think they're an exception. Generally, it's just like, well, what's the point? Well, these days things are different. The whole zeitgeist is different. I think what people want and expect from a live musical performance is cleanliness. It's really not to be surprised. It's to see in a live communal setting, essentially, what they could be listening to at home or watching on the DVD or Blu-ray or something. It's not the surprise of the live performance. With improvisation, with liberties taken, sometimes for better or worse. Think about the Replacements, brilliant one night, transcendent one night, and the next night they can hardly finish the song.
Yeah. It's an interesting point. Like, I know, like, if I go see Paul McCartney, which I've done several times, the way the drum parts are, for example, are so iconic. The drum fills are played a certain way, and they're just perfect. I want to hear those recreated in that way, because it's just part of the artistic statement. Whereas, like, certain songs that are more of a groove, like certain Stone songs, I don't know how you would feel, but I don't necessarily need it to be recreated how it was. I just want to, whatever contributes to like a powerful live groove performance is what I want to see more than anything. And a lot of that is the aesthetic of whoever is the band leader or musical director. Take Springsteen and the E Street Band, Max Weinberg, Mighty Max. You're going to get those fills, those drum fills, and they're as catchy. They're as much of a hook as any other musical aspect of the song. Right.
And he does it, year in, decade out, and that's great. And it works for the E Street Band.
Yeah.
That's obviously Bruce. That's, him calling the shots there, saying, this is what I want, and this is what I demand.
Right, because he's the boss.
Well, yeah. God, I hate that term. He apparently hated it, too, for many years.
Mm-hmm.
They're a very, very different band from the Stones.
Yeah.
Most bands are very different bands from the Stones, especially the Stones live. They really are still a band, even though they're kind of a Stones tribute band and have been since, let's say, 89, with, auxiliary players and singers, but they're still a band, and their sound, their aesthetic is of a band.
It's still a working live band, which is really cool.
Yeah, a working live band. And the one thing that they, even though they've gotten tighter in certain ways, they've also gotten looser in certain ways through the years. And it's a weird dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing you weren't going to, it's like Charlie Watts actually, it's kind of sounds ridiculous to say, but he got better, technically better, through year after year, decade after decade.
Mm-hmm.
And this probably isn't a guy who practiced a lot. He rehearsed with the Stones for live shows. How you think he practices his drums? No, he didn't. He said he said as much. He had other projects, jazz and boogie woogie projects that he'd play with.
Yeah, and for a drummer, it's harder because it can be so noisy in terms of disturbing the neighbors. I know Ringo famously never practiced on his own. He just said, "What's the need to practice? I play with my friends, and that's my practice."
Right. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, Charlie once said, tuning my drums? No, what's the point of tuning them? You're just going to bash them out of tune anyway. Well, I'm sure he's being cheeky.
Who said that?
But Charlie Watts.
Oh, Charlie, yeah, nice.
He's a funny guy, in his very wry, low-key way. But there's a lot of tracks, particularly the Stones, and I don't know who they're comparable with. It's an act of their stature that were just Frankenstein tracks in the studio, and they either couldn't or didn't want to attempt to replicate them live. It's only rock and roll. Think about that. The studio track, they never even got the rhythm pattern. They never even attempted. Even when they first started playing the song live in 75 with Ryan Wood, they never attempted to make it sound like on record, because it was a complete Frankenstein, spur of the moment thing. Mm-hmm. They got this appealing and to me a great rhythm basic backing track done with Kenny Jones on drums, mm-hmm. Willie Weeks on bass, Bowie on backing vocals, and Ryan Wood on guitar. Mick on guitar too. For better or worse, they never attempted to replicate live. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Back to producers. How much of that is the producer's call, which would lead me to one of my favorites, the Glimmer Twins, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. That their production team is known as the Glimmer Twins, and they've been referring to themselves as such since 1974. It's only rock and roll album. I want to say one thing about Jimmy Miller.
Yeah.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the only other work that I'm really familiar with that I love as equally as his work with the Stones would be a couple sessions he did with Johnny Thunders at Johnny's possible lowest in his life and career in 1982. Jimmy Miller was contracted to work with them, and they did some recording, some sessions in Revere, Massachusetts, with the great Jerry Nolan on drums and some unknown bass player, just live. They only did 4 tracks, and then Johnny disappeared.
Okay.
Johnny was wont to do. Well, they picked up the sessions again later, and recorded a further 5 tracks without Jerry Nolan, with some young drummer. And these sound more like Jimmy Miller productions. They actually sound like his work with the Stones. Mm. And then Jimmy Miller disappeared. Apparently his drug usage was on par with Johnny Thunders at that point. And the feature of particularly the second sessions is, once again, this great, fat, rich, murky sound. Johnny Thunders actually played bass on those second sessions, which is his original instrument, actually. But Jimmy Miller would be adding, the drum sound was impeccable, very forceful and thick, and the percussion that Miller would add would be as vital to a track, just like with the Stones. Mm-hmm. The tambourine, the cowbell, up front and center, the maracas, right there in your face.
And that was released, that album?
Yeah, it was. It's called In Cold Blood, and it was only 5 songs, and they did it was released on a French label, some fly-by-night French label, and it was a 45, a 12-inch 45, and then the second album was, just some, live tracks, of Johnny playing around the East Coast.
Okay, that's cool. I didn't realize that.
But the 5 tracks, well, actually they recorded 6 tracks that he did for the In Cold Blood album. So it's a mini album. Mm-hmm. They're just really punchy. They sound like the Stones in 1972, sonically. And a lot of that is to do with Jimmy Miller's drum and percussion sensibilities.
Yeah, that's cool. One of the surprises I came across researching Steve Lillywhite is that he produced So Alone by Johnny Thunders, which is a great album.
That would lead me, excuse me, to Steve Lillywhite. Yeah, that is a great album, and that's where I became familiar with Lillywhite. Mm-hmm. His name really didn't register until a few years later. I bought the album in 1978 in real time, and an import copy, Gem Records, remember them?
Yeah, we talked about them last time.
Right. But later when he started working with U2, and then shortly after that, Big Country. And the thing with Lillywhite, it was this great, expansive, I want to call it a cinematic sound, which certainly Jimmy Miller had as well, but with Lillywhite, it could be equally murky, but also very live and bright. Think about U2's debut album, Boy.
Yeah, I always associate there's certain brightness, like when I hear Sparkle in the Rain by Simple Minds or Boy, and I think that's one reason it sounds great if you played it on a small radio or a big system. It sounds great on both because he's got that nice bright high end to his best productions.
Yeah, it's almost like he was channeling the big, the Phil Spector, the Motown, aspects of production. The large, sparkly, magical sonic experience, and he certainly had that with on U2's debut Boy, and just weird little noises. I should mention a lot of these people that I've mentioned: Chris Thomas, Bill Price, Jimmy Miller, and Steve Lillywhite. They all featured weird little noises in their productions.
Yeah, which I love.
I do too. I mean, just the personality behind it, and then
like the bottles rolling in "I Will Follow," for example.
Sure, exactly. That's what I'm talking about. And then the next album, which is a little muddier and murkier, October.
Yeah, by U2.
Gloria, the breakdown in that,
Right.
The bass breakdown as it leads back into the final chorus. A coffee cup or a teacup fell on the floor, or a saucer, and it didn't break, but it rolled around, and you hear this.
By mistake?
By mistake.
Okay, yeah, that sounds so great. I didn't realize that was a mistake. That's so cool.
Yeah, and they, Lillywhite kept it on there and, treated it, with sound, so it's as much of a hook as anything else in the song. And with his best work, I just love that. The just strange frequencies, expanding his work on Simple Minds, Sparkle in the Rain, Mel Gaynor's, cymbals, giving him a weird, like, reverse delay or something. Like, well, who would think of this? What were you thinking, His work with Big Country, who actually probably didn't really need, they had their own sound from the get-go. They didn't need, Chris Thomas had their very first single, Howard's Home.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about this last time. And it's a very different style and sound, even tempo and arrangement from Stephen Lillywhite's re-recorded version for the Crossing, the debut album.
Mm-hmm.
But they probably benefited least from a producer because they had such an identifiable sound. They were much better musicians and technically better musicians, and they had more musical experience than, say, U2.
Yeah.
Their first album, they were still, a few years younger, and they just didn't have the skill and the chops. They were discovering their own sound in real time. But his work with Big Country's first two albums and the Wonderland EP they're majestic to me. They're just majestic sound. And the sound that he got with Mark Brzezicki and Tony Butler's rhythm section, that very mid-rangey tone that Tony Butler had on bass, and playing these intricate but very catchy, almost guitar-like bass lines, in frequently Celtic, a Celtic modal manner.
One thing I never thought about before is how did these kind of provincial, quote-unquote, musicians of Stuart Adamson and Mark Brzezicki convince these studio pros of Mark Brzezicki and Tony Butler to join their band? Do you know how that happened?
In the case of Big Country, they had a different rhythm section originally. I actually have some demos which basically sound like the Skids.
Okay.
The previous band. Very Euro sounding, very and rhythm section isn't particularly impressive, but they're very punchy, very cool. And I can't remember the guys' names. They had a keyboards as well. They actually tried out originally, Stuart and Bruce Watson, who's the Jams drummer, Rick Buckler.
Oh, okay.
That would have been great. I don't know if he would have been the right, fit for the band, but so the Big Country in their earliest lineup supported the Jam on their final UK tour in '82, and obviously, that's probably where Bruce and Stuart, met up with Rick Buckler, and of course the Jam imploded, broke up after that.
Yeah.
I've never heard any recordings or demos that they did with Rick Buckler on drums, but they did some shows with this other rhythm section, and they're pretty good. They're pretty damn good. One of the shows isn't very high quality. It's like at a youth center somewhere in Dunfermline, I think, or Fife or Aberdeen, somewhere in Scotland. And they actually opened for, I don't know who put this bill together, Alice Cooper, early on. And I guess played a few shows with him in, England or Scotland, somewhere in the UK. And Alice Cooper's road manager decided that Big Country was just too weird. And so they kicked him off the tour.
Yeah. We'll talk about a musical mismatch, but, back to Big Country, that first album, The Crossing, is a great sounding record, but I also thought Steel Town was also a great sounding record, their second one.
Those are both Steve Lillywhite,
right.
And they recorded that one at ABBA Studio in Sweden.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Stockholm, I think it's called Polar or Polaris Studio. I don't know if it still exists. But,
another, is there anything else you want to say about Big Country?
Just to finish your point, how these provincial, and yes, they were provincial. Stewart was actually born in Manchester, not in Scotland. His family moved there very young. And Bruce is actually born in Canada, not in Scotland, and his family moved back to Scotland.
And not to slight Stewart or Bruce in any way, because their skill was not provincial, but I'm just saying, how studio musicians of the caliber of Tony and Mark might have perceived them at the time.
They were, Tony and Mark were called Rhythm for Hire, and they played on Townsend's, solo debut, Empty Glass, and there were, probably other people I don't know about around, 1980, 81. They were, big in London and in demand, and I forget how the meeting came about, but apparently it was one of those things like their first, rehearsal. Just like they said, you guys are it.
And it may have been like an Andy Summers kind of situation. Like Andy Summers was a big, highly paid session musician at the time he joined the Police, but he was smart enough to see like the new wave, quote unquote, that was coming, and he really wanted to be part of a cool band. And there's something to be said for, some of these studio musicians, it could get a little boring, I think, being just a paid gun for hire, and it's fun to be part of a band.
The thing with Stewart and Bruce, the guitar players, is they were very advanced technically as musicians on their instruments, and they were interested. Look at the Skids, the 4 albums they did. It's really intricate. It's muso, to coin a phrase, they're playing. They also had, particularly Stewart, this massive energy and his great majestic sound and tone to his playing. I think after he died, it's either Joe Strummer or Mick Jones said that the Skids were the only band to ever open for the Clash that made the Clash nervous to go on stage.
Interesting.
The Skids opening for them somewhere in Aberdeen or somewhere in Scotland. I don't know how Mark and Tony, Tony's a first generation Jamaican from St. Andrews Parish in Jamaica, outside Kingston, which is ironic, considering that St. Andrews is the patron saint of Scotland, and his family moved to London. And
Tony Butler.
Mark Brzezicki, his dad was in the Polish, the Free RAF Air Force in World War II, and escaped Poland and then joined, the British Army. And they had infantry army units as well, but they also had a wing of in the RAF, Royal Air Force. His dad was a pilot in the. And Mark was, first generation Pole, or second generation, I guess. And so just an interesting combination of, where did these guys all come from, And of course, Stuart and Bruce, neither of them were actually born in Scotland. Bill Nelson from great from Bebop Deluxe. That's the name of the band. Stewart was a big fan of his, and Bill Nelson produced the Skid second album, which is very weird, Eno-ish, Bowie, Eno, cold European. Well, you'd have to listen to it if you haven't heard them. The very unique sound, but you can hear the early...
Are you talking about Bebop Deluxe now?
Oh, I'm talking about the Skids.
Oh, Skids, yeah.
But you can hear the early, influences into big country proper.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. I know the Saints Are Calling and a few other things, but I didn't know they were as muso-ish and as musically intricate as you're describing them. So I'm going to have to go back and listen. It's interesting you mentioned Bebop Deluxe, because one of the producers we can talk about later I have on here is John Leckie, who produced Bebop Deluxe.
Yeah. I know Leckie. He did a lot of great work. Well, he did early Simple Minds albums. Okay. So enough about big country. Over to you.
Okay. Well, let's finish up. I've got a list here of other Steve Lillywhite highlights. So let me just hit a few of them. The Laws, There She Goes, that song, There She Goes Again.
Yeah, that's Lillywhite?
That's Steve Lillywhite, according to my notes here.
No, I guess it wouldn't surprise me. He had, work.
Personnel. Okay, Lee Mayer, production. Steve Lillywhite. Yeah, okay. So, that's an interesting band, because that whole album is almost like a perfect pop record, and Lee Mavers just hung it up after that. But so I just wanted to mention that as part of Steve Lillywhite's credits. He did Susie and the Banshees, Hong Kong Garden single. He's credited along with Hugh Padgham, who was produced the last two Police albums, with on Peter Gabriel's third album with that gated reverb sound that would define the 80s.
Yeah, he did XTC too.
He did XTC, Drums and Wires. He did, as you mentioned, he did the first three U2 albums. He did How to Dismantle the Atomic Bomb. He did No Line. He was a co-producer, along with others, of No Line on the Horizon by U2, which is an overlooked, very good U2 album. He did
he worked on along with Eno and Daniel Lanois on Achtung Baby as well. Boy, there's a producer's dream right there. Eno, Lanois, and Lillywhite.
Yeah, you're right. I think they got stuck at a certain point on Achtung Baby, and they came to Steve Lillywhite for a few things.
Yeah.
Big Country, the Chameleons, Morrissey's. Some of Morrissey's solo albums, the Rolling Stones, Simple Minds, Fairy Tale in New York by the Pogues.
Well, I did two albums with the Pogues, yeah.
And two albums. So I just wanted to the first Psychedelic Furs album. First two. Yeah. So just wanted to cover those with Steve before we moved on.
Yeah. Well, no, not so fast. Not so fast there, Reverend.
Yeah.
One of my favorite Lillywhite productions is another just favorite album of mine. You only did one, and the band only put out one. They recorded a second one, but it wasn't released till years later. And that would be Sector 27.
Okay, what's that?
So it's Tom Robinson's band after the Tom Robinson band broke up. And they only did one album, came out in 1980, and it's just called Sector 27. And it's really cool. It's everything you want from Lillywhite production, but you don't have the grandeur and the glory of U2 and Big Country and Simple Minds, Sparkle in the Rain. Mm-hmm. It's really dark, and it's a very emotional album. It's not cheery like the Tom Robinson Band, and it sounds nothing like the traditional, rock and roll of Tom Robinson Band.
And what's it called again?
Sector 27.
Okay.
And it's a wonderful album. Every song is just a revelation. Tom doesn't play bass. He's got, I can't remember, Joe Bird played just a strange little three-piece band. They did some shows with the Police in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. And then that's a good one. Good catch.
And it's classic Lillywhite production. The weird noises and effects abound. It's weirder than anything on those first three U2 albums, the first two Big Country albums. Mm-hmm. It's one of his finest productions. Mm-hmm. I don't know about a lot of his later work. I know some of the albums he did with his future wife, the late great Kirsty MacColl, which are very wonderful sounding records because she's just wonderful as a songwriter, as a singer,
right,
as an arranger. Now, Steve he had said early on that he would never produce a band more than twice. Mm-hmm. We broke this rule with U2, with the War album.
Right.
Because for whatever reasons, because they were so great, or because the money was good, or he thought there was really something that was developing that he could work with. And he only did 2 albums with Big Country,
mm-hmm,
and the Wonderland EP as well. But so Lillywhite, okay, yeah. What?
I've got a good transition point from Lillywhite if we're done with Lillywhite.
Yeah, I think so. What do you got?
I think Brian Eno would be a good transition because we were talking about U2 and there's some similar crossovers there.
Yeah, it's a big deal. He's a big deal. I mean, not just as an artist, but his aesthetic as a producer. Yeah, he's a big deal.
Yeah, what do you want to? You got anything you want to say about him as an intro?
We were speaking earlier of mixers versus engineers. Recording in real time. Eno had I think maybe pioneered it, maybe with Roxy Music. Certainly with a couple of John Cale's mid-'70s tracks, if not full albums, of actually recording, mixing in real time. In other words, moving the faders
mm-hmm,
and that during the actual performance of the track.
Oh, interesting.
And, by his own description, is not a musician. I say that's BS. But that was, kind of his line for many years, if not decades, is that I'm not a real musician. I don't really play anything.
Right.
So one of the things, spawned some great producers, some great, sound auteurs, sound sculptors, Daniel Lanois,
right,
being the most obvious. And one of his things that Lanois got from Eno was playing the studio as an instrument. Now, a lot of people do that. They like a good room, a big room or a room with great sound. Keith Richards saying, I can walk into a room, snap my fingers, and tell if it's a good room to play in. Well, that's, Keith, his usual hyperbole.
Yeah.
There's that word again. But, actually, I think revolutionized recording, or his technique pioneered that idea of using, say, lavalier mics and finding the sensitive spots of a room, a recording room.
What kind of
For
mics?
different sounds. Microphones, lavalier mics. They're little bitty mics. People use them for like recording on like interviews on TV. They're
Okay.
ultra sensitive little microphones, little tiny things, and they pick up. They're designed for very small, specific recording locations, meaning on somebody's lapel on their suit on TV or something.
Mm-hmm.
And Eno would use those at different spots of a room to mic the room.
Mm.
And Lanois picked up on that, and that became Lanois' signature sound.
Mm-hmm. The big reverby, swampy New Orleans type of thing.
Yeah, well, I say New Orleans, but you can say, Canada too, where he's from. Both have
Sure.
that French influence.
Yeah.
I think it's a French thing. But that's something Lanois got from Eno, and Lanois needs a mention here. I don't want to go off too much of a track, because Lanois' sound and work has kind of fallen out of favor with me.
Yeah, me too.
I've become weary of it. The classic example would be the recent Bob Dylan bootleg series remix of his "Time Out of Mind" album, which was a big deal when it came out. Won a Grammy, and this is Bob's rejuvenation and all that. And yeah, it's a great album. I always thought it was a little too, not a little, but a lot too Daniel Lanois, as opposed to the earlier album he did with Dylan, "Oh Mercy."
Yeah.
More stripped down, more to the point. And I think the remixed version, where they took a lot of Lanois' outboard effects out of the mix, is the superior album.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to listen to that. I find "Oh Mercy," there's a lot of lightweight songs on there that aren't as great. The songs are better on "Time Out of Mind," but I'd love to hear the new version without as much of the effects, just to see how it sounds. So "Time Out of Mind."
Yeah, I agree with you about "Oh Mercy." I think half the album is just very slight. "Oh Mercy," there's just too many atmospheric ballads.
Yeah.
That just, for me, don't go anywhere. But the songs that are great, Most of the Time, Political World, Everything Is Broken, are great, and the sound sonically is great.
Yeah.
Well, I think he overdid it years later with "Time Out of Mind," and it just, those sessions went on forever. A couple different studios in Miami, and Lanois and Bob didn't see eye to eye a lot of the time. Was arguing.
Yeah, let's loop back to Brian Eno, just to stick with Lanois for a second. I've got on my list for him, he's one of my listed producers, because he worked with Brian Eno on the Apollo soundtrack, which is a great ambient album. And it's got what a lot of people overlook on that album is there's a country influence. There's a lot of pedal steel that is not often heard in ambient music.
It doesn't surprise me with Eno. His musical tastes and influences were very Catholic, very, very wide-ranging. Yeah.
Yeah. U2, again, this is like lines get blurry here, but just stick with me. Unforgettable Fire, Octung Baby, No Line on the Horizon. Peter Gabriel he was a co-producer. Emmylou Harris, Wrecking Ball. I think one of his maybe negative, one of his criticisms is he only had like one major type of sound, but the epitome of the greatness of his sound could be Emmylou Harris's Wrecking Ball, which is a great record.
Yeah, it is.
Willie Nelson has he did a great record with Willie Nelson called Teatro, which that's what it was called, where he recorded that album.
I've heard of the album. I don't think I've ever heard it.
It's I highly recommend it. And then we talked about this one, Lanois by Neil Young, where he was recording all these cool, like, more distorted electric guitar type of Neil Young guitar. That's a really fun record.
Yeah, just Neil on
right,
on guitar. No band. No.
Right.
Yeah.
Capturing the performance in real time. You cut out there for a second, but you're saying you captured the performance in real time.
But playing the performance, twiddling knobs, moving faders in real time as Neil played, and it would have been easier with just one guy, as opposed to a band or a small combo. But yeah, I noticed you did not put probably his biggest and most lucrative and famous work, U2's Joshua Tree.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of that record. I purposely didn't put that on there.
Yeah, no. You said that before. And,
there's certain things on there I really do like that really moved me at the time, like Red Hill Mining Town, as opposed to like the big hits.
Yeah, well, the big hits are just overplayed, but yeah, I'm in agreement with you. The B-sides from that.
B-sides were great.
Are largely better than most of the albums.
I would agree with you there.
Silver and Gold, the original studio version. There were several. They're just really, really, they're weird. They're weird. They could have been on the Unforgettable Flyer.
Yeah.
They're not,
That was the fun thing about buying, like, I think you had to buy the 12 inches at the time, right, of the hits to hear those weird B-sides.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I had them all. I think there was 3 for the singles, and then you had like 2 or 3 B-sides on them. No denying he's a great, and unlike a lot of producers or engineers, Lanois is, a very, very fine musician and multi-instrumentalist in his own sense.
That's right. He added, tracks to U2 records and probably other records, and very meticulous. I saw some documentary where he's working on Peter Gabriel's So, and he's such like a meticulous craftsman. Each sound is just so carefully thought out, and kudos to him for that.
And a fine singer too. He has a fine voice.
The what is it? To the Beauty of To Winona. That's a great record of his.
Yeah, those first 2 solo albums. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Beauty of Winona and I forget Arcadia. I think was the first one. Which featured U2 or Larry and Adam on a couple tracks. No, he's at one point he would have been my favorite producer ever of all time.
Mm-hmm.
Just his overall encompassing vision thing for music, how he just totally put his own stamp, his own mark on whatever recordings he did. And now I'm thinking these days it could be a liability in some cases. It's just like it's just too much Lanois. I'm sure he's a fine gentleman, and he, one of the greatest sound producers really of our generation or any generation. But I don't know. Does he have any new tricks? Could Taylor Swift use Daniel Lanois on an album? And if so, how would it work? Would it appeal to the Swifties? Would it appeal to the, serious sonic, connoisseurs.
Yeah. Well, he's still. I know he's still going. I saw an interview with him recently in his studio, and he's still got it going on.
Yeah. Well, more power to him. He's getting work, and putting out records. It must be an odd occupation. Like, what does your resume say? What does CV say? Record producer.
Right.
I mean, well, what could that mean? Guy Stevens was supposedly the producer of London Calling. What did he do? He drank and fell down and threw stuff around, threw chairs around the studio. I mean,
Yeah, but as an output, I mean, it's hard for me to think of a better sounding record than London Calling. I just love the sound of that record.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's Bill Price.
Mm-hmm. It sounds so great, doesn't it? I mean, just everything about it.
Yeah, it's it really is.
The drums, the percussion, the guitars, everything.
Yeah. Well, that's, Mick Jones learning very fast in real time. Mick Jones is a great producer in his own right.
The sound of the room, the sound of the band, the energy of the band just comes through.
And they leave all the, that's when you really got to know that this is a band that puts the play into playing.
Yeah.
They're playful. They were funny. The
Yeah.
Clash were a very funny, very clever band, but not just funny lyrically or thematically. People think they're a serious political band, a punk band, all that's nonsense to me. Political, they're about as political as Muddy Waters,
Yeah. Well, just think about Jimmy Jazz. You got all that, like, people talking in the background, and they're just having fun with it.
Sonic playfulness, sonic humor. Think of all the little odd, twists and turns and sounds that came out on that album. I mean, it was,
the percussion, the sounds. That's a big part of that album.
Oh, yeah. And, willingness to, we're a punk fan. We're supposed to be whatever punk rock meant to, kids in the UK in 1979. But no, we got pianos. No, we got horn sections. We got sax solos.
Yeah.
We got acoustic guitars. We got organs, B3 organs, pianos. But we got it. And we're gonna put it on because we like it. We like to play this way, and we're pleasing ourselves.
Yeah.
That's what the Clash were doing. They were pleasing themselves, making music that they liked.
Yeah, they were just a band at the height of their powers, and they could do whatever they wanted. It really comes through.
Well, think of all the horrible, horrible music that came, to my ears, and maybe you have a different take, that came out of the so-called, punk movement, the Oi band,
Right.
those hardcore bands, and in the U.S., the West Coast hardcore bands, just like bad music, bad attitude, bad politics, just bad, just downer music, It's like, no, that's not what punk rock was about. Punk rock is about having no boundaries. No boundaries.
And speaking of no boundaries, maybe we should loop back to Brian Eno at this point.
Yep, go for it. Yeah.
So I've got, again, a lot of these records, it's blurry, like, who is officially the producer, because, there's co-production and so forth, and with Brian Eno, I'm trying to stick solely to, like, production as opposed to, where he played, like, keyboards on Roxy Music records, for example, so.
Right.
But for production or co-production, Unforgettable Fire, right there, that record, that was a whole new universe for U2, and they really, as opposed to most bands, I think would have tried to get as popular as they could at that point, they really went experimental with Eno. Pride in the Name of Love, that was kind of going for a hit, but a lot of those other songs were almost like improvisations of Bono just making lyrics up on the mic, and the effects, and then Achtung Baby, Zooropa, No Line on the Horizon, all great U2 records where, this fifth member idea we talked about with the Beatles, he almost became like a fifth member of U2 in a way.
Oh, very much so, yeah. The last, U2, I lost track of more or less after the Zooropa album, which is, credited entirely to Eno. There's no Lanois on it. And that was the album that kind of, lost me. I've heard great things, after that, but I just kind of lost interest. And it's still, a fine band, and, I'll just leave it at that. It's kind of lost. And, I have, heard and owned, like, All That You Can't Leave Behind. That was a nice album. I don't know if it was the great album or the great return form that everybody thought it was. They've lost me.
But no, I just want to give a special mention to No Line on the Horizon, which I know he was involved with, which is a really good record. That's the one that's got like the black and white ocean photograph on the cover.
I know the record. I know the album cover because I see it in the used record bins, cheapo records. I can't remember any song from it, and
it didn't have a lot of hits, but it's a very solid, one of the better U2 records. And then back to Eno, again, lines are blurry here because Visconti was involved. Eno was involved, but Bowie, the Berlin trilogy, Lowe, Heroes, and Lodger, Eno was largely responsible for helping Bowie define a new sound. Lowe is just such an exciting record and really kind of set the tone in a way for like post-punk in a lot of ways.
It did, and oddly enough, Bowie got a pass from the punks, at least in the UK, during that period, which is ironic considering side two of Lowe, the instrumental side. I actually think that's an overrated album. The sound, sonically, though, is just wonderful. It's wonderful. And Heroes is even better, and the better album.
See, I think Lowe is by far the best of those three, but it's such a subjective thing.
Well, it is. Lodger, to me, I think it's the best album. It's the most playful, the weirdest. Mm-hmm. Visconti did a full remix because it was a very murky mix.
Right, that was the problem with that originally, yeah.
Yeah, he did a full-on remix, which is, it's day and night. But that's the weirdest. Mm-hmm. And what is Brian Eno if not weird? He's also beautiful too, and playful, and nursery rhyme like melodies, some of his own. His first two albums, solo albums, are just note perfect every track.
Yeah, and he's bringing even though he, like you say, he's more musical than he lets on. He's really bringing an artistic sensibility. He is famous for those oblique strategy cards where you come up with new ways to imagine that you're playing. Other things he did later on, he worked with Coldplay. He did early around the time of Bowie, he did Devo, Are We Not Men? He did a few years later. He did Talking Heads, Remain in Lights. All kinds of interesting stuff he did.
He did 3 John Cale solo albums in mid-70s. Fear, Helen of Troy, mm-hmm. and Slow Dazzle.
Fear, I know. That's a great record.
There's a song on there called Gun, and it's a long song, Phil Manzanera from Roxy Music on guitar. And it's, a long, 6-7 minute song. It's a really creepy, really hard, brutal song. And Eno is treating Manzanera's guitar in real time as they were playing with his weird little suitcase of, things that you'd plug in and whatever back then that had his little magic bag of tricks.
Oh, okay, interesting.
And speaking of Cale's no slouch. He's as a producer. Think of some of Cale's.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, Pat Smith's debut.
Yeah, that's a great record.
Pulses. The Stooges' debut.
Great record.
Which I actually think is a little overrated, considering the next two albums were just, over the top.
Mm-hmm.
And both very different from each other, and different from, Cale's original production. A personal favorite of mine, Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers' first album.
Great sounding record.
Great sounding. It was recorded as, just demos and wasn't released till 4 or 5 years.
And it sounds so contemporary, even today. It's got that kind of fresh, like new wave punk kind of sensibility. But it was recorded in '72. It's way ahead of its time.
Oh yeah. Think about the Strokes and the great success they had.
Yeah.
That's the Modern Lovers right there.
Yeah. Good point.
Jerry Harrison from the Talking Heads on keys. David Brooks on bass. Not Chris Robinson. He's the Black Crowes guy. He's a Cars drummer. What's his name? David Robinson. Yeah. So all these guys went on to bigger and better things,
mm-hmm.
later in the Modern Lovers. But it, as you say, it does. It sounds like it could have been recorded 5 minutes ago. Just stripped down, basic. Not pretending to be on big production or anything. Just the songs and pure personality coming through.
No, good call. Got to mention him.
Yeah. He did a couple albums with Eno, too. One from, I think, 1990 called The Wrong Way Up. It was a straight-up collaboration with him and Eno. It's a delightful album.
Mm-hmm.
Half the songs are Eno and half are Cale's, and they both work on each other's songs. And it's just the two of them, maybe one other two musicians, adding flavor here and there. That's a really good one, Cale and Eno.
Nice.
Okay. So Brian Eno, no slouch as a musician, as a creator of a vibe, creator of sounds.
And now on a related note, because it's kind of in the same wheelhouse, we should mention Tony Visconti, I think, because they worked together, and Visconti on the Berlin trilogy.
Oh yeah.
So as a producer, the T-Rex records, that's Visconti. Talk about great sounding records.
Yeah, well, he did, several Bowie albums as well.
He did, Now, I made some notes about this. He did the first Bowie album, self-titled. He did Man Who Sold the World. He was
a bass player on that, too, as well. He was the Spiders from Mars. He was their Spiders from Mars original bass player. The Man Who Sold the World.
Right, and then he kind of took a break for a few albums, and then he came back with the Berlin trilogy.
Well, no, he came back with, probably my favorite Bowie album, Diamond Dogs.
Oh, Diamond Dogs, okay.
Bowie's first post-Spiders from Mars album.
Okay, right, good point.
Ken Scott had done the 3 Spiders from Mars albums, Hunky Dory.
Right.
Aladdin thing.
Yeah, good catch.
A great producer in his own right, Ken Scott.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, back to Visconti, Berlin trilogy, Scary Monsters, and then the later Bowie albums, Heathen, Reality, Next Day, and Black Star. Black Star, that last album he did with a lot of the jazz musicians, that's a beautiful sounding record.
It really is. Yeah, it really is. It's not an easy one that I listen to a lot. Not just for sentimental reasons, because it's the actual sound of the guy dying in real time, singing it and composing and arranging it. But yeah, it's a great sounding record. And the one right before it, The Next Day.
Next Day is a great record. Great pop, more like really great pop record, almost.
So, yeah, exactly. It's like almost every song could have been on the radio.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. Visconti, yeah, great musician, great producer.
A few other fun records he did. He did some records with Dean and Britta from Luna.
I've heard of Luna.
And Dean, the leader of Luna, I'm forgetting his last name, and his wife Britta, the bass player from Luna. They did some solo records produced by Visconti, and also Difford and Tilbrook from Squeeze. He did the record they did as Difford and Tilbrook, which is a good record.
Yeah.
Dean Wareham. Sorry, that was his name from Luna.
What was it?
Dean Wareham.
Oh, right. I've heard of him. Yeah. Luna. I know Lou Reed really liked them. He thought they were the closest thing to developing capturing the Velvet Underground's kind of essence.
That's right. They definitely were.
Maybe the softer side of the Velvets.
Like the rhythmic, strummy side of the Velvets. They just developed that par excellence.
Yeah. Lou apparently really liked that. We have not mentioned Bob Clearmountain, and we probably should.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, primarily a mixer. He once said in the documentary Blood Brothers about the E Street Band reunion in 1995, they did a reunion, recorded a few songs in the studio for a Greatest Hits album, Springsteen Greatest Hits album, and said, I'm basically a mixer by trade.
Mm-hmm.
But he famously co-produced with Steve Van Zandt, Bruce, and John Landau, the Born in the USA album. But worked with Bruce quite a bit. He said, I hate to give the E Street Band so much credit, because this is my job, but he said, they almost mix themselves in real time as they're playing.
Wow.
Such was their experience with each other. That, somebody would drop in, Roy would drop in, Danny would, on the B3 would come in, or, a guitar would come in for a little bit,
Yeah, because that's the benefit of a band playing so well together. It almost reminds me of those first recordings where you'd have one microphone and you'd have to place everything just in the right distance from it, and the band would just be playing in real time almost.
Right. You'd have to learn how to play with the other players.
Right.
You'd have to mix yourself in real time.
Yeah.
But Bob was saying that in relation to his primary, gig, which was a mixer. But he produced, as a producer, he's produced, and mixed some of my favorite records. He did the 12-inch, the long version of the Stones' "Miss You" from the Some Girls album, which is wonderful. And basically, you just jacked up the bass and drums, but it's a full performance of the song without the edits. So it's not. But anyway, Garland Jeffries, Escape Artist from 1981, just a wonderful sounding album. The Church's second album, Blurred Crusade. It had this big booming sound. It still sounded live. It sounded like... Yeah,
it's a great sounding record. Even today it sounds very good. It aged very well.
Yeah, well, his sound, I think, it sounds organic, but it's clearly artificial. It's clearly something of the studio. It's like, no, drums don't sound like that in real life, but it's... just a great knack for pulling out just the sounds, the instruments in a section, just the right things at the right time.
Yeah.
He made very loud records, loud-sounding records. Even if the stereo is at low volume, they sounded big.
Yeah, I always think of him as like, he's got a big, punchy sound.
Yes, very much so. So yeah, Bob Clearmountain, great sound engineer, and clearly a guy with great, artistic sensibilities as far as shaping sound for a band and an artist. I'm going to have to throw in Leonard Chess from Chess Records here.
Yeah.
It's a big deal,
Yeah, good one.
Don Marshall Chess would go on to work with the Stones, not really in a production. It's more of, I don't know, he's a stage manager or tour manager or something. General dog's body, I think, as the Brits would say. But think of what Leonard Chess brought the world at Chess Studios. Now, Bill Price, we haven't really, touched on any. His name's come up a lot. What do you think of Bill? What's the take there? A big guy, primarily, originally, an engineer.
Yeah. Now, I ran into some real challenges researching him. Like on Wikipedia, for example, a lot of people, you can go to Wikipedia and clearly see like what they produced. With Bill Price, that's not the case. But let me show you what here's some things that I found. Pretenders, with Chris Thomas producing, he mixed those first Pretenders 1, Pretenders 2, the EP, and Learning to Crawl. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, those are my favorite Pretenders records.
So let's give him kudos for that, even though we're talking about producers, because that just goes so hand in hand with the sound and the production of those records, right?
Again, he had that same quality of a lot of guys we've mentioned here, from Chris Thomas to Lillywhite, certainly Eno and Lanois. Guy who appreciated noise, weird little noises and textures.
Yeah, he just had a great ear for the textures. Also mixing the first 3 Townsend solo records.
Yep. Those are my favorite, Pete albums. Some of my favorite, Who material, period.
Was that Chris Thomas producing?
Chris Thomas did Empty Glass. Chris Thomas did all the Cowboys Have Chinese Eyes.
Okay, so they were working together there.
Chris did White City, I believe, with Bill engineering. Well, those first 3.
Yeah, okay. So that covers that. That was one of the topics that kicked off this whole conversation about producers, right? Was Bill Price and Chris Thomas working together, and what a beautiful sound they got. And then I had the Pistols, which we talked about earlier. Carbon Silicon, Nick Jones's offshoot from the Clash, with Tony James.
For Generation X, primary songwriter also for Generation X.
Right, and you and I saw them live, which was fun, right?
Oh, it's one of the, it was a great show, yeah.
He mixed Mott the Hoople, he mixed the first Clash record, we're back to Bill Price now.
Yeah.
And then later he did the Libertines, who Mick Jones produced, so it's another kind of connection with the Clash, and Baby Shambles, which was Pete Dougherty from the Libertines, who Mick Jones also produced. So he did some cool later stuff too.
Yeah, I would be remiss not mentioning there's only one track to show from it, but that would be Chris Thomas and Bill Price working with the Clash. And that would be on an album called Concert for Campuchia.
Oh, okay, sure.
A double album that came out as a series of, I think, 2 shows played in London in December of 1979. Late December.
Yeah, a classic performance of Armageddon Time.
Yeah, and the other bands on that, the Pretenders, the Who, Elvis Costello, the Specials, Queen,
Yeah.
Chris Thomas and Bill Price. did that album. But the show, the Clash's set for that show is, well, it's one of the first bootlegs I ever had of the Clash. Mm-hmm. And it was actually played a little fast on vinyl. I've since, received the correct speed of it. But it is almost unnervingly tight. Mm-hmm. Not that the Clash were always really tight, mm-hmm. but the sound, you could tell, even as an audience mix, was really deadly, really deadly.
Interesting. I wonder if they did a lot of rehearsal, or if they were just that tight.
They were just, London Calling had just finished that, and that
right,
had just been released like that week in the UK.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be till the next January that would be released in the U.S. That's why people think, oh, it's one of the great albums of the 80s. Well,
right.
It came out in 79. But my point being that if they have the multi-track tapes of the Clash's, their entire set, 16 songs, that was the name of the bootleg of it on vinyl, which I got in 1980 as a 15-year-old. 16 tracks is the name of it. That would be possibly the greatest live album ever recorded.
So that's interesting. I don't think I've only heard like the few tracks on the album. It'd be really interesting to hear that full set.
And it's a wonderful sound. It's extremely, and this is as an audience recording. Mm-hmm. It almost sounds like it might be a board mix, but it clearly isn't. But just judging from that one Armageddon time, that was released on the album proper, Concert for Kampuchea.
Yeah.
Chris Thomas, Bill Price, individually, they're great. Collectively, they're better. And who better to work with than the Clash,
Yeah, Joe, he's got just these great little scat asides, like, use a calculator. It's not Christmas time, it's like so cool things he says.
Well, the great thing about the Clash Live is that, they had their own way of jamming. It wasn't the Grateful Dead's way of jamming. It wasn't the Coltrane Quartet's way of jamming. It was their way of jamming.
Yeah.
And a lot of that had to do with Joe having a big mouth.
Yeah. But he had something to say.
Huh?
But unlike a lot of people, he actually has a lot of interesting things to say.
He was a shaman. Shaman.
Yeah.
Is what he was. He was I think that's how he viewed his role. More than a singer, more than a guitar player.
That's a very good observation. I like that.
And I'm sorry to Mr. Paul Hewson, but far more effective shaman than Bono is. Yeah, Joe really had something very, very special. And a lot of it had to do with his mouth, big mouth, and you couldn't understand a lot of, I've heard a ton of, Clash bootlegs, of varying quality and varying audio quality. They're, uniformly, I think they're one of those few acts or bands that probably never played a bad gig.
Yeah.
At least, but, the original, the original band.
Yeah.
There may have been, degrees of goodness or greatness comparing it with themselves, but they probably really never just... And that's one of the reasons they couldn't last long. They had to break up.
Yeah, the quality, and they were one of those bands that, never took a vacation, it's just full throttle, you just couldn't sustain it.
They should have taken a vacation. They should have, and that's why they didn't break up. But Paul Simmons, right? He didn't want to do a reunion. He didn't want a reunion for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame award. He didn't want to do a reunion for when Joe died. Paul's right about it. And they offered him, just ridiculous money to do a one-off show, as a reunion sometime in the 90s. And Paul said, no, I don't want to do it. Mm-hmm. We had our time. We made our mark. They never sucked. They didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, Clash Mark II, which is essentially just, the Joe Strummer band. Yeah, that's a whole different band, a whole different vibe to me. It's a Clash tribute band.
Right, and it was Joe as the gang boss, as opposed to like, four individuals, kind of more of a democracy type of situation.
Yeah. It's five. It's five guys. They need two guys to replace Mick Jones, and of course Paul. Just was Paul. There's Paul thing.
Right.
It's just a different thing. It's a very good hard rock band with something to say and an irritating lead singer. And Joe was irritating as opposed to interesting on a lot of those. There's a lot of bootlegs out there from that period. I've got the show that you and I saw in May of '84.
Yeah.
You ever want to record that? It's good sounding. It's pretty good sound too. But
one of the things that I'm not sure I want to relive it, but one of the things I do remember clearly is having to wait forever for them to come on.
Shangoya opened for them.
Yeah.
The local reggae band. They also opened for them in '82 on the Comeback Rock show. But just Chris Thomas and Bill Price. If they ever get somebody's got to have, Sony. Somebody's got to have the multi-tracks of that gig. Mick Jones probably had the inside joke amongst hardcore Clash fans is Mick has all this stuff in his garden shed, And
Yeah.
every few years he pulls something out and says, "Yeah, I found this," and the
Right.
Clash do another money grab, re-release, Clash Incorporated.
Now you say Sony has those tapes in their vault. Which ones are you referring to specifically?
The concert for Campuchia.
Campuchia, the actual, the
December
original tapes. Yeah.
27th, 1979, at the Hammersmith Odeon,
Yeah.
London. With, I think it was two shows. And I think the headliners were The Who and Queen.
Yeah, there had to be if the Clash played 16 songs, there had to be 2 or 3 shows. I mean, I can't imagine every band played 16 songs.
On the album, the Ian Dury and the Blockheads, Elvis Costello and the Attractions, the Pretenders, I think maybe Nick Lowe and Rockpile. It's a double album on vinyl. It's been released on CD, I think. I don't, currently have it on CD.
Anything else you wanted to cover before I hit Nick Lowe?
Lowe was a very, very good call, and big, influential. Done some great people. Very distinctive sound. Very distinctive aesthetic. I think Lowe's sound, and this is, think about the Pretenders' debut singles, the Stop Your Sobbing.
That's right, that's a Nick Lowe production.
Yeah, how different that sounded from, Chris Thomas's, work on their, debut and their next 2 albums. And, it's a different band. He's a different drummer. Martin Chambers hasn't joined the band yet.
Oh, on Stop Your Sobbing?
Say again?
On Stop Your Sobbing?
Right. Martin wasn't in the band yet.
Oh, I didn't know that. Interesting.
Yeah, there's I forget the guy's name, some Scottish name. But Nick liked big, fat acoustic guitars, with the ringing electric guitars,
Yeah, such a great sound.
It's kind of a slight sound. It's not like a big sound. It owes a lot to like rockabilly and country, I think.
Mm-hmm.
His sensibilities.
Yeah.
His drum sounds are not like big, punchy drums. They're kind of almost in the background, in the mix.
Yeah, well, think about, that band, Rockpile, Seconds of Pleasure, that album. The band he was in that I assume he produced, which is very rockabilly, country-ish in its influences, and just a great sounding record.
they're a great band. Think of the guys in it.
Yeah.
You got Lowe on bass and vocals, Dave Edmonds
That's
on
right.
guitar, who the Stones apparently considered, and there are many considerations for a replacement for Mick Taylor in '74. Billy Bremer, another great guitar player.
Great guitar player.
Guitar player on the Two Pretenders tracks, My City Was Gone and Back on the Chain Gang. And played later, later album up there is called Pact. And I can't remember the drummer. Drummer is great. I can't remember who he was, but they were just a great band of, just great individual musician, but collectively.
And in terms of, great records Nick Lowe produced, he produced the first 4 Elvis Costello albums, My Aim Is True, This Year's Model, Armed Forces, actually 5, Get Happy, and Trust. And those are all great sounding records, with especially, I think, the first one, the third one, Armed Forces, and the fourth one, Get Happy, all have their own distinctive sound, but just sound great.
Yeah, my favorite sounding ones of those would be, This Year's Model and Armed Forces, I think. Of those 5. But yeah, just a great, and again, kind of like Dan Lanois we talked about earlier, Lowe is an actual, real musician and a great musician too. And a singer and a songwriter and arranger, so he's not just a producer, he's a very, very well-rounded musician.
Right. He also did I think the first Graham Parker record, and he also did Paul Carrack from Squeeze, who sang Tempted. He did his album Suburban Voodoo, which has got a great sound to it. So that's all I got for Nick Lowe. You got another producer?
Yeah, probably not. I mean, no. My parting commentary would be, I think this is what a good producer is, what the world needs now is a good producer. So there's so much of this music that it just all sounds, they're bad sounding records. They're just bad sounding.
You mean music today?
Yeah, and I'm not even going to talk about, the hip-hop, so-called hip-hop era. I mean, the Bomb Squad doesn't exist anymore. And, but, the Taylor Swifts and Olivia Rodrigo. Actually, I've heard a couple.
Yeah, and I heard that's a really interesting topic. I heard some people talk about this yesterday, and part of the reason for that is, people think they can just, music is a disposable product, and B, everyone thinks they can record things at home, and music, the art of production, and how things sound together, and the sound of the room, and the energy of the track, kind of gets lost as people just try to make things sound as professional as they can, track by track, without thinking about the track as a whole, if that makes sense.
Rooms, do they actually, meaning one of the wealthiest women on the planet, Taylor Swift, does she record in a room? I'm sure it's in a building. So, yeah, I guess by definition it's a room. I don't think that's the aesthetic. That's not the sound. That's not the paradigm. It's got to do with computers.
Right. Now, take Billie Eilish as an example. Billie Eilish?
Yeah.
She records with a very expensive microphone, but she records, sitting, at least her first albums, just sitting in the studio is just kind of in a room at their parents' house, and she's just sitting cross-legged on her bed, singing into the microphone.
Her brothers,
So it's not about the sound of the room; it's capturing her voice. But To your point, the sound of the room has kind of gotten lost, I think.
Well, I don't think there is a sound of room. And yeah, Billie Eilish sounds like she's sitting on her bed in her room, and she sounds like she's actually prone, lying down in her bed. You were saying she records in, well, you could have fooled me, man. It sounds like all those other records. It just sounds like they were recorded inside the software of a computer.
Right. And the other thing is, like, just recording budgets, it's very hard to, people don't have a budget to, like, hire a producer as much as they did before. I think, who will actually produce, the way you and I are talking about producers. Okay, let's put a pin in that. There's a couple other honorable mentions I just want to mention before we sum it up.
And before you start editing me out. Yeah, go for it.
So, okay, so I just don't want to overlook Todd Rundgren, the New York Dolls' first album, and 'Cause I Said So. Right?
Okay.
I know you appreciate that.
Oh, not just the Dolls' first album. Tom Robinson Band's second album, TRB2.
Yep.
Psychedelic Furs' third album, Forever Now. Very distinctive sound.
Patti Smith, the album Wave. XTC Skylarking, maybe their best XTC album.
Yeah, just such a weird sound. It's so loud and blaring and in your face, and just like, it's like Todd would be saying, I'm going to make the ultimate pop record. I'm just going to, like, everything is going to be really loud and colorful and cheery and in your face. Yeah, very strange.
Which record are you talking about now?
I'm just talking about his general
sensibility.
Sensibility as a record, and I really don't know much about his actual work with Utopia or as a solo artist. Hello, it's me. It was 25, 30 years before I even knew that was Todd Rundgren.
Right, and it's back to your point about he was a producer who was also a very accomplished musician.
Oh yeah, for sure, yeah. But just an odd way of making records. I mean, great sounding. Some of those records are just, great favorites of mine. The Dolls debut, Tom Robinson, Psychedelic Furs records.
Another one, John Leckie, who we mentioned earlier. He was involved on the first, not as a producer, but as a tape operator or something on the first John Lennon Plastic Ono Band solo record. And then he went on to produce the Stone Roses, Radiohead, Bebop Deluxe, The Fall, Felt, Denim, Robin Hitchcock, The Verve, Ride, Ian McNabb. So he has some
Simple Minds. I think he did a couple early Simple Minds albums too.
I bet you're right. That makes sense. And then Hugh Padgham did Ghost in the Machine and Synchronicity, Sting, Julian Cope, Split Ends, Time and Tide. Mitch Easter did the first REM EP and also the first two records, Murmur and Reckoning. He did Game Theory, his own band, Let's Active. He did Marshall Crenshaw. And Giles Martin, George Harrison's son, did the Beatles. And, when George Martin started to lose his hearing, Giles Martin kind of became his set of ears. And Giles worked on the Beatles anthology, the Paul McCartney album New, and all these recent, a lot of very beautiful remixes of Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, White Album, Abbey Road, the Red and the Blue albums, and the new Beatles quote-unquote final single Now and Then.
Well, he did the Love album too.
That's right, and he worked on the Love remixes, which were really fun, actually, quite inventive.
And very creative, very inventive. That's, to me, that's the final great Beatles album. It's not Let It Be, either, with or without Phil Spector. It's actually the Love album. That qualifies, I think, as a standalone, work of art. In Beatles canon. Wonderful work by Giles Martin. Good call there. Hugh Padgham, I want to say this. One of my favorite bands ever of all time, the Waitresses. Talk about them. They only did 2 albums and an EP, but their second album was Hugh Padgham did it.
Oh, cool. Very cool.
And the sound is just vastly different. The band sounds not vastly different, but just the whole vibe. It's really loud. It's really blaring. Billy Fica's drums are really loud, really blaring. And this is, 1983. And it sort of doesn't work. The songs are less catchy. I think it's equally as compelling. It's not quite as great an album as their debut, but it was Chris Butler, the architect and songwriter and guitar player behind, which chose Hugh Padgham for his work on XTC. Apparently, Chris Thomas is one of his favorite bands. So I'll just throw that in there. Padgham, and it doesn't work. They're not an English or British band. From Akron, Ohio, and New York City. A different vibe, a different sensibility. Well, Chris Butler, he wanted, damn it, I want Hugh Padgham to do it, and then we got this, record company money, and they said, we can afford them, and the band broke up in the studio. Patty Donahue left. I tried to get Holly Vincent from Holly and the Italians to come in, take her place. That didn't work, so I got, the bass player, Tracy Wormworth, to do vocals, and that didn't work. They released 1 or 2 song versions of her vocal takes, but then Patty came back, finished the album, and they promptly broke up.
Oh, okay.
As all great bands do after 2 albums.
No, that's cool. I didn't know his connection to the Waitresses. I really like the sound of the second to last Police record, Ghost in the Machine. That's a really great sounding record. And then just to tie a bow on it, he, along with, he was working with Steve Lillywhite on that Peter Gabriel third album where they came up with that gated reverb. And I don't know if that was more Lillywhite or more Padgham, but between the two of them, they came up with that new sound.
Yeah, it's hard to say. That became ubiquitous in the 80s, for better and worse. But Lillywhite certainly had that, and Hugh Padgham, certainly had that as well. Again, British guys with their really, really big drum sounds, for some reason they...
But I hope that, this... Even though, in a lot of ways, production has kind of been forgotten in today's music, I hope by, having, the discussions like you and I are having, it doesn't have to be forgotten. There's a certain art to production that's just as important as the song that is written and the musicians that are playing and the mixers and the engineers and everyone else involved. It's such a critical part of the process.
Yeah, it is. I'm still listening to the new Stones album, regularly, and I just love it. But you knew I would. You
like the production of that?
Well, the sidetrack. Steve Lillywhite did their Dirty Work album in '86, and that's widely considered their worst album ever.
Yeah.
I've come to like it, but I remember being very disappointed with it when it came out. I was expecting, oh, wow, Lillywhite's doing the new Stones. They haven't had an album out in 3 years at that point. And just it didn't work for me. I love it now. I mean, I like it. So I like the Rolling Stones. I like their aesthetic. I like their vibe. But whatever. Sound-wise, it wasn't happening, and so that leads. I'm getting up to the current one. Hackney Diamonds.
Andrew Watt, is that his name? The producer?
Andrew Watt. Yeah, I guess he's a young, like early 30s, New York City guy.
Yeah, whatever his deal is, he must be bringing something interesting to the picture, because an interesting side note is Paul McCartney, I guess, is working with him on his new upcoming stuff.
Yeah, that's apparently how, they were talking, and Jagger and Paul were talking, and Paul turned him on to it, and Jagger said, yeah, I've already got him on my radar. Yeah, okay, so, Ozzy Osbourne, if you like that kind of thing, you've done him. Did Iggy Pop's last album, apparently, and apparently that was a really good record.
Who, Andrew Watt?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And Justin Bieber. If you've ever heard Justin Bieber, okay, he's produced Justin Bieber. I guess that's, well, he got paid for it, so, whatever.
Okay.
Justin Bieber got paid. No, the sound of the record I don't like.
Of what? The new Stones record?
Of Hackney Diamonds, new Stones album.
Yeah, I think it just sounds crazily like overproduced, like reverb to the 9th degree.
I'm calling it overprocessed.
Overprocessed, yeah.
Yeah, me too. I listened to it on headphones one time on a crappy system, but apparently the Stones have released. There's an Atmos mix of it. Atmos is an audio system like Dolby or whatever.
Right.
Like, okay, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah, it's kind of like, remember in the 70s they had like quadraphonic, like 4 speakers. Atmos is like that, right, but like on steroids.
Okay. But supposedly it sounds really good, and there's things that come out of the mix that you can't hear on the standard release.
Yeah, that's what they say about the new Beatles mixes too. Yeah.
Whatever.
Most people don't. Yeah.
Most people don't, but apparently it's commercially available and for download. I don't know if there's a physical release of the Atmos mix, but that's the only problem I have. Is the processing, I'm calling it, on the new Stones.
Yeah.
Like the Rolling Stones, okay, this is a bar band, this is a garage band,
Yeah.
And why Stones had to sign off on it, they had to approve it, And,
yeah, I don't get it. I mean, especially when you listen to how great some of their, we talked earlier about their great sounding albums, how great those sounded, why you'd want it to sound like this, I don't know.
Yeah, if you want to talk about sound, make sure there's a distinction between the sound of the record and the songs, or the instrumental tracks, or there's a distinction. It's I think a real distinction. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I mentioned earlier, like Taylor Swift, or Olivia Rodrigo, or Ariana Grande, whatever. Maybe there's some good songs there. Maybe there's some great songs by my life.
Yeah. Now I will say about Olivia Rodrigo, I have newfound respect for her, because I've seen a few things she's done on like Saturday Night Live or late night television, where she's like playing piano. She's like a real musician. She's the real deal. She's not just a singer put up and to sing songs.
On her new record, what's it called? Guts, I think. I've heard 2 songs that I actually kind of like. It sounds like she's been listening to The Waitresses and Romeo Void.
Yeah. Yeah, she's got some interesting things going on.
Yeah. Are they good sounding records? No, I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't think the records sound good. I think her ideas sound good, and that's why I'm saying maybe get her. And of course, instrumentally, is there anything to listen to instrumentally? Can you follow? Like, you get in a groove, you know, you eat a gummy and you have a beer and you go, wow, I mean, you're grooving on the bass track, or you're grooving on the guitar, or the sax, or the molten fiddle, or the flute.
You know, I want to hear I want to hear people hitting bottles with sticks. I want to hear teacups mistakenly falling off the table, rolling around. I want to hear some interesting mistakes.
I do, and I'm not joking. I know you're not joking either.
No.
I do. I want to hear those things.
I think that's part of what's gotten lost.
And the musicians union is going broke, and they don't know what to do because they ain't getting any work. And, you know, and people don't want to be musicians anymore. If they do, they're, you know, oh, I'm going to be the fastest guitar player ever. I'm going to be, faster than anybody else. I'm sure there are people out there working. It's a big world, and guitar bands. Not like everything lives or dies by whether you have an electric guitar in it. But musically, I'm not hearing anything on these records. These current, I'll call them the Taylor Swift records. That thing. Now you can say, and with some legitimacy, that. Well, okay, that harkens back to the Phil Spector and the Motown, aesthetic, the hit factory thing where, Phil Spector triple tracking, double tracking the drums and, quadruple tracking the pianos and like that. I mean, you're not supposed to pick out instrumental. It's just instrument. This is symphonic sound. Fair enough. I still think they're bad sounding records. The mastering is bad. The mixing is bad. I'm not hearing them on a good system, I hear most of the stuff at work.
Right, but with that being said, like you're talking about mainstream music, I'm still hearing, there's great music out there. Like, just to give you an example, today I was listening to a radio show by Guy Garvey from the band Elbow. He does a weekly radio show on BBC Six Music. And he was playing this band called Flyte, Flyte, an album from 2019. A song called I Still Believe in You, and it's a great sounding record. And there's still a lot of beautiful music being made, but the thing is, like, it's harder to find it, but it's out there.
Yes, I agree with you 100% on all your points. I agree with you. I'm using the lowest common denominator, culturally speaking, as a reference point. There was a time when we could have used Michael Jackson as that reference point, or the Beatles as that reference point, or Elvis Presley, or Frank Sinatra as that, the lowest common denominator thing. That's why I'm talking about the Taylor Swift sound, her current sound. And that aesthetic, and it has a lot to do with technology, and technology is by nature, it's an advancing, encroaching thing. It encroaches upon our lives, our sensibilities, how we experience the world, how we experience life, everything, the internet, everything, the internal combustion machine, and people want Andrew Watt, this produced young guy for his last Stones album. So, what's the deal? Here's my take. He's got backing, he's got pressure, backing, whatever you want to call it, from big money. Software and technology manufacturers and promoters are saying to him, Andrew Watt, use our technology on the latest McCartney or Stones or Justin Bieber. Use our technology. Do it. And he, oh yeah, of course I am. It makes it easier to make records, cheaper to make records. You don't have to hire real musicians. And if you do, it doesn't matter. You just loop them, and you don't have to do 17 takes. You just do one take, and good enough. Thanks. Here's your union scale. In that way, I think the technology, although technology in record making has obviously been a great thing, I think right now it's hit a wall in how records sound and how they're being made. And it's not like, you have to spend, $3.5 million to make a record, or whatever, or however many dollars, depending on the year or the era. But they sound, the records, I'm telling you, Taylor Swift might have some good songs. I've heard a couple that sound all right. She's perfectly mediocre. She might be even good. She might be. I can't tell from the damn recorded track.
Because it's not produced well.
No, it is not. And probably not mastered well either. Mixed. Maybe they're mixed well, exactly how she wants them mixed. I don't know. But there doesn't seem to be any ideas behind it except get this out the door. You could say that about, Motown or Stax Records, we're hit factories. I don't know. I know if you listen to Otis Redding and Paul Thomas doing Tramp with Booker T and the MGs, all four of them, and, the Memphis Horns, all two of them, in one take with no overdubs. Well, Carl actually overdubbed her vocal. They didn't do it at the same time, but never mind. From a hit factory, meaning Stax Volt Records in 1967, that track was recorded. It's a little before Otis died. There's stuff to listen to. You want to listen to the guitar? You like a big fat bass? Hey, duck down. You can just groove away. You like a big drum sound? Al Jackson Jr. You want some horns. You want a little tinkling of piano. Booker T. Jones. There's stuff to listen to. There's personality behind it. Otis and Carl are fading in and out of the mix. It sounds like two people having a hilarious conversation with each other. And where is that on the record charts? Olivia Rodrigo. As I said, and there's a couple tracks, and she's doing the conversational thing on one of them. I think it's called Get You Back or Get Him Back. And it sounds, for all the world, it sounds like 1982. It sounds like The Waitresses. It sounds like Romeo Boyd. It sounds like Late Era Blondie. So it can be done, It can be done. But the actual sounds of the records, I don't know. So, to wind this back, I love the new Rolling Stones record, but it's not a lousy sounding record.
Right. And one other record I'd like to mention, which relates back to your point about Stax, is Big Star. You ever listen to them much?
Yeah, no, that's still a blind spot. Everything I've heard, I've loved. But, yeah. And even, Chilton, Alice Chilton, Soul, stuff, everything I've heard, I've loved. But I never, I just never got into them. I never jumped on the Replacements bandwagon and, started listening to them.
Okay, well, they, their first record is cleverly called Number One Record. And right. They were from Memphis, Tennessee. They recorded at this studio called Ardent in Memphis, and they were big Beatles heads. And they didn't have a lot of money, but they were buddies with the guy who ran the studio, and he let them at Ardent.
Ardent, yes.
And so the owner would let them come in and just spend their own sweet time whenever there was downtime, like in the evenings, and record throughout the night. So if you want to hear like a great produced, a great sounding record, those Big Star records, and just as an example, #1 record, just an incredible sounding record.
Yeah, Jed, we've talked about it before, and I believe you and trust your instincts. I believe Paul Westerberg and trust his instincts as well. And I'll get into it when I get into television.
Yeah, there you go. And the next record, Radio City, that was 1974. That was also a great sounding record by Big Star.
Sister Lover, was that?
Sisters Lovers was like 78-ish. Also a great sounding record. Yeah.
I believe you, and I trust you, and no, I will. I'll do my due diligence, and I'll learn something and get some musical joy in life.
Yeah, if nothing else, just pull them up on YouTube. You can listen to the television, Marquee Moon, Big Star #1, Big Star, Radio City, because Big Star deserves honorable mention. Just if we're going to talk about the Memphis connection, reminded me of that.
Yeah, and Chilton was, I don't know, as a producer, he was, a big producer, did a lot of people. He did, the demos, initial tracks for the Replacements, Tim album, which were just released on the big box set that came out a few months ago. And they're great. And how much of that is the band or the engineer, or how much of it is Chilton's input, I don't know. Because I love the record anyway, and all the outtakes are just pretty much fabulous anyway. But so I don't know. Was he renowned as a producer? Later in life when he was doing his solo thing?
No, not particularly. I'm looking right now at the Wikipedia page for like the Big Star's first record, because I feel like there was a producer who was involved, producer John Fry. Okay, so he was the producer of, he was the founder of Ardent Records. Okay, so he was the one who let them use the studio. He was like really smart in terms of electronics and stuff. So we should give John Fry a lot of credit for the sound of these Big Star records.
Now I may be way off on this, but I'm going to suggest that I thought I'd heard Ardent was the old Stax studio after Stax went bankrupt and folded in like 74, 75, I want to say, that Ardent was the renamed studio. Am I completely just making this up or imagining this?
No, I think you might be right. There's some connection there.
Jim Dickinson, who produced
Ardent Studios. Okay, here we go. Was founded by John Fry. It was initially a studio in his family's garage. Blah, blah, blah. Tom Dowd was consulting with Audiotronics on an early multi-track console for nearby Stax Records, and Fry ordered the same input modules for his second mixing board.
I know Tom Dowd. I know his.
Ardent became the first 4-track studio in Memphis. Ardent became home to young producers such as Jim Dickinson. That's who I was trying to think of.
You're about to mention him. I was just interrupting. He produced the Replacements' Pleased to Meet Me album.
Right. Ardent came to have 3 studios equipped. So, yeah, I was thinking Jim Dickinson had produced those early Big Star records, but...
he was a session player at Muscle Shoals Studio. He's part of the house band. He played piano on, like, the Stones' Wild Horses. And they recorded that and Brown Sugar and You Gotta Move while they're on tour in America in '69.
Jim Dickinson played on it.
And Jim Dickinson was a piano player with the house band at Muscle Shoals in Alabama.
Now I figured it out. So the first and second Big Star records were John Fry, who owned Ardent Recordings and Studio. The third Big Star record, which is called Third or Sisters Lovers, was produced by Jim Dickinson. So there's the connection.
Yeah, and Dickinson then later produced The Replacements,
right.
Pleased to Meet Me,
which had the song Alex Chilton on it.
Say again?
Which had the song Alex Chilton on that record, correct?
Right. And it was recorded in Memphis at, I believe, Ardent Studios.
Right. Okay, that would make sense.
Yeah. We're small world and all that kind of thing.
Mystery solved. I feel much better now.
Okay, yeah. And I've learned something.
But if you want to hear like a record that just sounds, even if it was recorded today, like number one record by Big Star just sounds so good. And like we were talking earlier about, drum sounds and guitar sounds and just each thing recorded so well. Those first two Big Star records, number one record at Radio City, just sounds so good.
No, I believe you. It's just, I gotta get some more money in my bank account, because I don't do streaming. I like physical product, and that's it,
Sure.
But there are just a blind spot, and as you know, I just have many, many blind spots, stuff that I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's why it's great to have these conversations. Like, you hit me to, like, some Tom Robinson stuff that I'm going to have to check out that I didn't know about.
Sector 27, man.
Yeah, Sector 27. I'm going to check that out for sure.
Song after song, it's unnerving. It's like Tom almost yells through a lot of them. He's on, he has that classic BBC English accent, I think they call it, with the Tom Robinson Band and much of the solo work. And his vocals are just really raw on this, and they're really sound really personal and intimate, not the socio-political concern of the Tom Robinson Band. And just musically and sonically, what is this stuff, It's a rubbery rubber band bass playing, just a freaky guitar player, multiple overdubs, obviously, but, Gang of Four, I want to say, angular quality, and The Edge is in there as well, and just Lillywhite just doing the classic thing, just the weird, the noisy, cinematic. Yeah, it sounds like a movie. It sounds like a movie. All 10 songs. It's a very short album.
Yeah, it sounds great.
I think you personally, would like it. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, it was good. Well, you'll have to sprinkle your magic fairy dust on it and make it, palatable to the masses, to the millions who tune in every Culture Drop podcast that we do. There are millions of people waiting on our every word, and I just want you to make it palatable.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of time before we get sponsorship from BMW and Frito-Lay and everybody else.
Right. Oh, well, in my family, I completely forgot. This guy, Jed Bonniwell. You heard of this guy from Minneapolis? He's pretty good. Check this guy out. Got a great album out called Space Summit. Great project. Yeah. Okay.
There you go, man. You're the best spokesman out there. You just got to start walking the streets.
Thank you very much. I'll send you an invoice and you can send me the check.
The check's in the mail.